the richest empires in the history of the world. Over the course of the 4.543 billion years that Earth has existed, many humans, kingdoms, and empires have come and gone. They rose to power, and then some of them were never to remain, while we still have traces of some of them to date. One of the shocking things about the days of the old is the staggering wealth some individuals and empires had to themselves. Today we bring you some of the richest empires that ever existed on the face of the Earth. Can you guess which empire was the richest in history? Watch out, it might not be as you imagined. Welcome to the world of X. We are obsessed with the rich, so we bring you all the inspiring stories and information to help you be like them. Subscribe to our channel and give this video a like as we prepare more insightful videos like this one for you in the future. If you're feeling lucky, press the bell icon so anytime we upload a new video, you get to see them first. Most sources hold that money was not invented until between 600 and 650 BC. We may not know exactly when people started using money as we know it, but we know for sure those empires that had it all, and it was mostly the trading empires and those that went around conquering the world. Let's get into the video. Number 11. The Spanish Empire, $23.9 billion. One of the largest empires in history is the Spanish Empire. The empire was part of the era that ushered the European Age of Discovery. But one thing they were also known for was their immense wealth. At the height of the empire in the 1700s, they are said to have achieved a GDP of $23.9 billion. This isn't surprising. They controlled parts of modern-day Latin America, the Philippines, parts of Europe, and Africa during the late periods of the 15th to 19th centuries. Number 10. Ottoman Empire, $26.4 billion. The Ottomans weren't only ruthless in their adventures, touring and conquering the world, but they were also wealthy people. The empire rose in the 13th century. They were people of art and had an excessive drive to achieve, which was made use under the ruler Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who led the empire from 1520 to 1566. At its peak, the empire had a GDP of $26.4 billion, as they controlled Anatolia, parts of southeastern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Number 9. The Roman Empire, $43.4 billion. No doubt the Roman Empire was one of the most powerful ones we have ever seen. A great civilization that went down at a time when its size became a problem for it in the 3rd century, and it finally went down to the barbarian invasion in the 5th century. At the height of the glory and wealth of the empire, it had an envious GDP estimated at $43.4 billion, a GDP most countries in recent times cannot boast of. Number 8. India's Mughal dynasty, $90.8 billion. If you have heard the word Mughal often used to describe a businessman, then you have had a touch of the Mughal dynasty. The word Mughal originated from the Mughal people after it got corrupted and borrowed into English. These people were indeed well-connected business people who were the short callers of their time, and at the peak of their economy they had a GDP of $90.8 billion. The dynasty was founded by a man called Babur in 1526, who was a Central Asian Muslim prince, took to the invasion of the land called Hindustan, which is modern-day India. At a point in time, the dynasty was so large that its economic activity accounted for 25% of the world's trade. Number 7. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, $100.5 billion. The Austrian Empire was left in rags and poverty after the Austro-Prussian War in 1866. This meant that they had to find other ways to survive post-war. This was when they entered into a partnership with the Kingdom of Hungary, creating one of the most powerful alliances of its time. They could now boast of power, a strong military base, and a boosting economy well diversified into manufacturing and other profitable fields. At its highest moments of financial glory in 1913, the empire had about 3.7% of global trade, with a GDP of $100.5 billion. Now that we've entered the arena of the $100 billion empires, what empires do you see coming next? Number 6. The German Empire, $126.1 billion. The German Empire is the second $100 billion empire. The empire was formed after the unification of the German territories in 1871, creating a world superpower even in modern times. They had an industrialized economy and partook in the scramble for Africa, colonizing parts of the continent, which boosted their rise to wealth and power. At its height of economic prosperity, the empire had a GDP of $126.1 billion. The empire may not exist anymore due to its defeat in the First World War and subsequent downfall in 1918, but its wealth is still something to behold. Number 5. The French Empire, $234.1 billion. The French are widely known for their colonization campaigns in Africa, North America, and India. This happened over the 16th and 17th centuries. But the French were also wealthy people, partly due to their exploits of the world and the trade opportunities they had overseas. When its wealth rose to its peak, the French were responsible for 5.2% of the world trade and a GDP estimated at $234.1 billion. Number 4. The Qing Empire, $247.2 billion. The Qing Empire was the largest in China, the last imperial dynasty of China, and the world's 5th largest empire. Its sheer size tells of its numerous riches. Many of the richest empires of the old were created from their size, trade, and other economic activities. The Qing dynasty was founded in the 16th century and was one of the world's manufacturing champions in the 18th century. Can you imagine how much of the global trade was as a result of the dynasty's activities? It was a whopping 32.9% of global trade, with a GDP of $247.2 billion. Number 3. The Russian Empire, $257.7 billion. At its very heights, the Russian Empire consisted of parts of Europe, Asia, and North America. It was ruled by the Romanov dynasty and created by Tsar Peter the Great, after the empire laid to waste the Swedish Empire in defeat. At the time, the Russian Empire was a world financial stronghold. They had a GDP of $257.7 billion, accounting for 9.4% of world trade in 1913. Number 2. The Mali Empire, $400 billion. The ancient empire of Mali has a history of wealth. So it's not surprising how wealthy it rose to be under the rule of a man named Mansa Musa, the richest man in the history of the world. He was so rich that he brought with him 12,000 slaves, who each carried 1.8 kilograms of gold bars, and heralds dressed in silks who bore gold staff, organized horses, and handled bags. But before arriving at Mecca, he made a stop at Egypt. His stay would turn out to be devastating to the Egyptian economy, as his spending and generosity drove prices up, creating inflation, which took years to correct. At the greatest heights of the Mali Empire, Mansa Musa controlled an amount of $400 billion, but most sources say his wealth is incalculable as compared to Julius Caesar, who is said to have managed the modern equivalent of $4.6 trillion. Number 1. The British Empire, $683.3 billion. The British have always been ambitious. It's said to have been the largest empire for well over a century and included about a quarter of the world's population. At the time, it controlled $683.3 billion in 1938. A few decades after this feat in 1870, the British would reach the world's largest economy as it accounted for 23.8% of global GDP. The empire is known to have amassed such wealth from its colonial activities and controlling 13 colonies, including parts of North America and parts of Asia, like its former colony India. Conclusion. One thing is obvious: these territories had the ambition and freedom to execute their plans without any hindrances from external power, but only through conquest. Most of them had thriving economies and had the manpower to drive their massive growth. So, what do you think? Are these the richest empires in history, or have we missed a few? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the World of X for more great information like this.